Listen-only mode.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's Auxis Corporate Performance Series webinar, Cloud Security, Move to the Cloud with Less Risk. My name is Yazan Arroyo, and I'm the moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar is presented by Auxis. Auxis is a unique consulting and outsourcing firm comprised of former industry professionals who don't act like traditional consultants. Offering a customized, real-world, results-oriented approach, we become ingrained in our clients' culture and vision and truly dedicated to their success. Our depth of experience allows us to maintain a focus on customization, flexibility, and bottom-line results at a very competitive cost structure. At this point, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker, Jose Alvarez. Jose is the director of the IT Managed Services practice for Auxis and leads our IT Outsourcing and Solutions practice. Jose has extensive experience with large multinational companies delivering best practices. His expertise includes IT strategic planning, cost control programs, emerging technologies, IT operations, and infrastructure management. Before we begin, let me remind all participants we welcome your questions. Please submit them in your webinar panel at any time, and we will address your questions at the conclusion of the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker, Jose Alvarez. Jose?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this particular webinar. This is very interesting, related to cloud security, and we're going to be touching a little bit on Amazon as an example of some items that need to be considered. But throughout the agenda and this afternoon, we're going to go through a few slides of the cost of data loss, and these are very interesting numbers that I want to share with all of you. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Amazon security, some of the services they offer from their perspective to help organizations secure their workloads in the cloud. Then we're going to run into a slide about the security approach in general and move to best practices to secure cloud implementation. So these are real life experiences and topics that we want to discuss to make sure everybody's aware of. Then we're going to move to security toolkit and services, and we're going to talk a little bit about the tools that are out there, modern type of services that allow companies to secure their platforms in the cloud. Talk a little bit about security controls as well. This is very important, as any organization that keeps security in place, you need to have some controls to make sure that you're doing the right thing. And finally, we talk about a summary about the takeaways. With that said, let's start with the cost of the data loss. We have a couple of slides that show you some of the numbers that have been released by IBM and Ponemon Institute on the recent data breach study that was completed in May 2015. This is their 10th annual benchmark study, and basically it focused on the cost of data breach incidents for companies located in the United States. This year's study, it's very focused on looking into the cost that was incurred in 62 US-based companies in about 16 industry sectors. And it is after those particular companies experienced the loss of theft of protected personal data. Now, what is a data breach? So breach is basically defined as an event in which an individual record is put at risk. And sometimes this record could be a social security number, could be a medical record, financial record, etc. For this particular study, we have identified three main causes of data breach. It could be due to a malicious or criminal attack, a system glitch, or human error. And the cost of the data breach can vary accordingly to the cost of also the safeguards that are in place on the company on the time of the data breach. We're also going to touch in another word, the compromised record. So a compromised record is the one that has information that identifies the natural person whose information has been lost or stolen in the data breach. Some examples will be like a company's database with individual names or credit cards, information of that nature that has been lost. In the past 10 years, The most costly organizational breach occurred in 2011, as you see on the chart on your left-hand side, when companies spent an average of 7.24 million due to this. Recently, in 2013, companies have experienced a net decrease in total data breach cost to 5.4 million. But last year, basically the total average cost rose to 6.53 million, which is a little bit alarming. The average total cost of data breach grew by 11%. Abnormal churn of existing customers increased by about 3%. In the context of this particular study, abnormal churn is identified as a greater than expected loss of any customer in the normal course of business. On the next slide, we see a couple of interesting charts. The one on the left talks about the industry and what is certain industries have higher data breach costs. So when you see there, you see the ones with the higher cost are basically health, pharmaceutical, financial type of companies. They're heavily increased, while some others like the technology or research or hospitality, I mean, they're really below the average. Now the chart on the right reports the average per capita cost of a data breach since the inception of this particular research series 10 years ago. And according to this year's report that was just released, data breach cost companies an average of $217 per compromised record. Out of those, $143 pertains to indirect cost, like, for example, what I mentioned before, abnormal turnover of customers. And another portion, $74, represents the direct cost incurred to resolve that data breach, such as investment in technology, services, tools, legal fees, things of that nature. There are factors that influence the cost of data breach. As we see on this particular chart on the left, incident response plan team that is in place already, the extensive use of encryption, CISO leadership, etc. All these basically are influencing into the cost of data breach, but they are usually reducing the cost. Now you have some other components that actually increase the cost of the data breach loss, and some of those are, for example, third-party error, quick notification, loss of stolen devices, the engagement of consultant or companies to support the incident response team are factors that really increase that cost. What's interesting also is that the more record loss, the higher the cost of the data breach. So on the right side, you see that there's a relationship between that total cost of data breach and the size of the incident for those 62 companies that were benchmarked. This year, the companies that had data breaches involving less than 10,000 records spent an average of 4.7 million, and the ones that lost about 50,000 records or more, they spent almost $12 million. What you see also is that some industries are more vulnerable to churn, and this chart on the left-hand side shows the abnormal churn rate for the benchmark organizations on that particular study. There is a small sample size that prevents us from generalizing the effect of industry on data breach cost. But these industry results are really consistent with the prior years. You see that financial, health, technology, pharmaceutical, and some of these organizations experience a high abnormal turnover from a customer perspective. But the other ones like public sector, research, and communications, they tend to experience a relatively low abnormal turnover. So the implication of this analysis is that industries with the highest churn rates could significantly reduce cost of data breach by putting an emphasis on customer retention and activities to preserve that reputation and brand value. The next chart shows the 10-year trend for those costs as forensic and investigative activities, assessment, audit services, decreases team management, etc. The average detection and escalation cost increased dramatically from 0.42 million to about 0.61 million. And that is actually telling us that companies are investing more heavily into these activities now. And lastly, from a number on this particular section, we see that companies that participated in this annual study reported higher cost to respond to and to remediate a data breach. This increase can be probably attributed to the finding that companies are spending much more on detection and escalation activities. They are also facing increases in the cost, mostly of the breach, the malicious or criminal attack. So we see that trend on a lot of the companies, especially the ones that have migrated to the cloud. They're spending more into services, into tools, and third-party vendors to help them with security measurements just to avoid this data loss. We're going to talk a little bit later on this presentation on some of these services, some of these tools that are the trend these days on companies. Now, what you should know in terms of moving to the cloud, big risk or companies have concern about the security on the cloud. So we put a couple of slides that shows what are the similarities from managing security in a data center, what are the differences, and what you should be considering into moving to the cloud. From a similarity perspective, going to the cloud, it's basically having the security on the cloud is basically the same as having it on the data center, but there are additional complexities that are avoided and by protecting facilities and hardware on the data center. Now, cloud security is mostly based on software-based tools or services that monitor or protect the flow of the information that goes in and out of the devices or instances that are on the cloud. But how is that cloud security the same as data center security? So you still need to do patching on services and servers. Microsoft patches, for example, that are released on a monthly basis, they will still need to be applied. Linux patches will need to be applied as well as monthly, quarterly, depending on the time frame. You still need to separate environments through the use of subnets and firewalls, and companies like Amazon offer services like security groups besides the access list, so you can have very specific rules to protect your workloads or devices from being accessed through certain other devices or people. The normal setup of traditional three-tier architecture with a DMZ, that's going to be the same on the cloud, same on the data center. You still need to separate your web servers, your application servers, your database servers, and protect the access to them. Set up access based on roles and needs. As a data center on the cloud, you have ways to say, I want this particular administrator to only have access to this particular service or systems or networks. And mostly it's done based on roles. The use of centralized log monitoring and management systems. Log monitoring has been big for years, but I think it has increased the usage and the controls in the last 2 years or so due to the increase on data losses. So these tools are now, although the concept is the same, the tools are a little bit different because of the type of services that are provided on the cloud that make it easier to get them implemented and up and running. The setup of VPN tunnels to your cloud as you're doing your data center, that doesn't vary whether you use your provider's VPN services or you implement virtual routers to do your VPN tunnels. It's going to be still about the same. And the encryption of the data or objects, that's not going to change. You still need to have a lot of encryption, and that's one of the main things that you need to consider on the cloud as well. Now, let's talk about the differences. We talk about similarities, let's talk about differences. If you go to the cloud, what do you need to consider from security perspective? So obviously system admins, they're no longer going to be touching hardware, they're going to be managing everything remotely and everything is virtual. well, not everything is virtual. Most of the devices are virtual. Um, Instead of using a lot of hardware-based appliances or devices, you're going to use a lot of software-based security tools and services. Also, you don't need to do racking, stacking, but instead you're going to be launching and configuring devices virtually on the cloud. The use of digital signatures and crypto keys are really important to connect to, for example, in the case of Amazon, to the APIs. And instead of using like a single firewall on Amazon to protect the network, each resource can have their own firewall. And this is called a security group. This is a great feature from Amazon that most of the companies take advantage of. But if they don't, we strongly suggest that they use this. Basically, with a security group, you can restrict the access to a particular database from only a particular server or user, etc., but very, very restricted. Now, you can still perform penetrations and vulnerability tests, but you need to get approval from your provider, in this case from Amazon, so they understand that there's going to be some kind of a test and they need to ignore the alerts that they're going to get from the backend infrastructure. You can still create images, AMIs, for the servers, and but then you will load them as you launch a new instance. On the cloud, you need to protect the AWS account credentials because this is your root account, and if somebody have access, obviously they have access to the whole platform, and then you need to create access for individuals that then will belong to a particular group or a role which will restrict their particular access. The security on the cloud is shared between you and your provider, on this case within AWS, and we have another slide that we're going to show you how will that separate. But also one big advantage for compliance perspective is that you can get reports from AWS on their certifications from ISO, PCI, etc. for the backend infrastructure. So you know that the underlying infrastructure of Amazon is secure enough for you to run your workloads. So what are the advantages on the cloud? Configuration management. With these tools that are service-based, software-based, you're going to have very good visibility of what you manage on the cloud. There are many free security tools that are included into Amazon, and we're going to mention some of those in the following slides, but one just to mention now is a service called CloudTrail that tracks every single change that you do on the cloud, and you can integrate that with your log monitoring system. In that way, you know if somebody added a device or changed configuration or added a role or remove an account. All this is going to be tracked by CloudTrail, and you can integrate into your monitoring system. Data privacy compliance by region. Amazon offers different data centers that are called zones, and they have different regions. So they have privacy from region to region. Significant DDoS protection, and we have seen this working. If they have a DDoS attack at the infrastructure layer, then we're going to get notified. But no matter if you have a big implementation on Amazon or a small implementation on Amazon, you can get the same type of security services and benefits from them. Obviously, they maintain the hardware for you, so they're going to have continuous hardware upgrades and patches from the back end. And part of the security compliance will be already achieved on the underlying infrastructure of Amazon. Now, I mentioned this before. There's a share model for going to the cloud, and on Amazon is very specific, so we want to go through it really quick. A common mistake is to think that when you are on the cloud, and if your provider like Amazon is PCI compliant or SSA 16 compliant, then you're going to be protected. The reality is that they're going to be protecting the global infrastructure, which is the box on the bottom. They're going to make sure that the underlying infrastructure is all protected and it has the right compliance and controls in place. But the customer is responsible for any data and application on the implementation. So all the servers, all the data, all the implementation that you do on your particular subnets or networks, or call it VPCs, will need to be protected by the customer. And this is a common mistake, so that's why security tools and security monitoring for the cloud is so important. Now, we're going to go through a couple of slides about some of the security services that you get from Amazon, and I think this is a good example because it tells you what is available out there that comes with the service. Some of them are, most of them are actually come with them. It's free of charge as part of your sign up. So starting with the network, they have different security options that help you to control access to your devices. So for example, secure communications using SSL or TSL. This is the encryption that they use, and it's available to you to get it implemented. The built-in firewalls, and which they call it ACLs, or even those security groups that I mentioned before, they're part of that. You can just take them, implement them. You can configure your private subnets. So once you get your VPC, your virtual private connection network, you can define your subnets and you can protect each one of them as needed. End-to-end encrypted transmission. So for many of the services, they offer that. And lastly, direct connect. So if you have for example, an MPLS network and you want to connect your cloud services or platform into your MPLS network, you can drop a connection using direct connect, and then that will be a dedicated connection from the cloud to your particular network. From an access control, they offer a few things that are important to consider. One of them is you can access services via API, but API will request authentication that will challenge the particular account to access those services. For the host, they offer the SSH access, although a lot of the companies for web services disable SSH access, and they rather the server to be destroyed and a new one to be created in the event of an issue. Unique users, so you create users, and those users are individuals that will have certain permissions, so they will be assigned to groups or roles which will define those permissions. MFA, multi-factor authentication, this is an option, but you should enable that for all the accounts, and that allows you to download, for example, a Google Authenticator on your phone and have a different token for authentication into the cloud. Permissions for S3 buckets and objects. So there's a service called S3, and it is like a file server, is a bucket, and you use that to store critical data or files, etc. You can define on this particular service the duration if that you want to keep those particular items in there. You can define permissions to see who has access. You can make that bucket available on the internet or not, etc. So you have a lot of flexibility on that service. Restricted view access for any private CloudFront content. So CloudFront is basically the CDN service for Amazon that puts the content of your website closer to the end user based on the region. But you can say this particular content I wanted it private, this one I wanted it open to the public. And some temporary security credentials that can be created for contractors, etc., that can be managed very easily with Amazon. Next, we talk about monitoring and logging. So in the data center, you have to implement your own monitoring and logging mechanism to track everything that happens on your platform. With Amazon, you get some tools out of the bat that you can use on your implementation. For example, allows you to, there is an asset identification and configuration review. Through CloudTrail, you can have track all the changes that happen on your platform, and as I mentioned before, you can integrate that into your security log management tool or your monitoring tool. They also offer a monitoring tool called CloudWatch, and although CloudWatch gives you 2 weeks worth of data, it's a really great tool to monitor the performance and the health and security and availability of your resources on the cloud. You can configure the basic parameters, but you also have a way to configure very specific predetermined parameters into CloudWatch as well. Log access to S3 buckets. So if you want to track who accessed the S3 buckets, you can get access to these logs and you can have all that information in there. And they also offer a nice service which is called Trusted Advisor. Trusted Advisor basically is a tool that runs every so often as you want it to run, and it gives you some tips about what kind of security gaps you have into your platform that you can take with you and you can implement in terms of getting it corrected. Backup and replication. So once you implement your cloud, you need to have a strategy for securing your backups and replication. This is really important. So for example, the EBS, which are like volumes that you attach to your systems, allows you to do backups or snapshots. Same thing you can achieve with RDS or the relational database services. They also offer replication of database, so if you get that service, you don't have to worry about backups or replication. You just click of a button and say, I want this database to be replicated and I want it to be backed up, and you provide that window. S3, which is your buckets for files, you can enable versioning. So when you put files in there, you know what the version is, similar to something like SharePoint will give you. Also, automatic archiving in Glacier. Glacier is a service for low-cost archival. It's usually considered like a tape type of mechanism to archive data that you don't use much, but you need to keep for a certain time. So once you put a file into S3, you can put a rule that says that after 3 months, I want these files to be moved to Glacier for low-cost archival, and that happens automatically on the back end. Also, protection for deletion of objects in S3. You can say, I don't want these objects to be deleted without a particular permission, so you can implement that. And secure backups of on-premises data via AWS, the storage gateway. Now, from data encryption, which is really important for this particular topic, they provide some services. They give you encrypted storage. They give you centralized key management. And they also have a service called Cloud HSM, which is a dedicated hardware-based crypto storage service. So you can take advantage of that. We have customers that are using the encryption from Amazon, and it works very well. Now let's talk a little bit about the approach, and this is a really high-level slide that talks about the 4 components for security approach on the cloud. So providers like Amazon, they give you a global secure infrastructure and foundation, and that is a great accomplishment right away. But then customers are responsible for protecting the data. Some of the mechanisms that we just talked on the prior slides, services that are provided by your vendor, they should be implemented and utilized, and additional tools could be also implemented for additional security and monitoring and controls. Now, much of the security now is moved out of the enterprise architect hands, and security actually is part of everybody's role. There's a lot of focus on security these days, and mostly on the cloud. So if an administrator is not spending that much time in the hardware into fixing this type of issues, they're going to be spending more time into securing the workloads. Now, lastly, make intelligent choices in the design or selecting the tools that you're going to use for securing your applications, operating systems, data, etc. There's a lot of choices out there, and you need to have your key tool that you can use to do the security. Now we're going to spend a few minutes to talk about what are the best practices to secure the cloud implementation. So first thing, as any data center or cloud services, you need to make sure that you have effective governance, risk, and compliant processes. The processes that we implement on the cloud are not exactly the same that we implement in a typical data center. So we need to make sure that the processes for adding users or deleting users or adding instances, removing, changing are very, very well specified, and everybody's aware of them, and there are some controls related to that. The audit of operational and business processes. So on a normal basis, you need to make sure that you audit these processes because the processes change throughout the time, and one of the major mistakes from companies is when they develop this set of governance and operational processes, they just let them run, and if something changes, they never get updated. They need to be looked at it, and they need to be updated as things change, and they need to be standardized. Implementation of cloud controls. So there's a combination of manual and automatic controls that they need to be implemented. We have a section about that at the end, and it talks briefly about some of those. But definitely, like any implementation, you need to have very specific controls to make sure that your processes are being followed and they're being followed properly. Create an access management policy. So as I mentioned before, Amazon, as an example, provides something called IAM, which is the security of the cloud to get into your platform from a console perspective. And this is where you define your roles, your groups, and you define your users and the type of permissions that these users have based on the roles. And lastly, adopt the patch management approach. So people think that because we get the servers from the cloud, we don't need to patch them. And the reality is that you still need to make sure that patches are applied, that you are on top of that. Amazon will give you access to some of those patches or most of the patches if not, but you need to make sure that they are applied and you do them on your window, etc., and you have some kind of redundancy, so hopefully you don't affect your application. Implementation of active monitoring solutions and controls. So these days, I've heard a lot of companies saying, yeah, we do have log monitoring, for example, and we track all the logs and for all the systems that we have on the data center or on the cloud. But the reality is that companies may be probably capturing those logs. They're probably having them on a centralized system, but in most of the cases, they're not being monitored as they should, and they're not being configured properly that they could alert if any particular conditions are met. So you need to make sure that these logs from all the systems, and logs can be from the operating system or it can be from an application, are all captured, they're monitored, but they are reviewed as well. Obviously, this is a very, very important part of the organization and the security side, and logs, as everybody knows, will help us to look into investigations when we need to do forensic investigation of some kind of event that happened, but also allow us to do prevent any issues, because we start getting any kind of indications of some kind of attack or something is happening, we can react pretty quickly and then block, stop the attack, and then hopefully control that type of access. I mentioned this before, but building a toolkit from a security perspective is really important. Some companies think that if I go to a particular vendor or manufacturer, I can use that tool, which comes with different type of flavors of items. So for example, the tool may be doing web application firewall, it might do some content control, it might do some log monitoring, etc. But in reality, there's no single piece of software or service that is going to handle every security need that you have. So you need to make sure that you have and you define what are the right tools or services that you're going to use for securing your web. And the new tools that are out there are web application firewalls, which are mostly services on the internet that will check every single packet that you get into your web server, and before it gets sent to your cloud, it inspects the packet and then block it if it thinks it's an attack. Antivirus protection, intrusion detection, encryption, log management, etc. So all these tools, as I said, you're not going to find a single manufacturer that has all these things, and if there are, then obviously that's something that needs to be looked at, because you may want to pick up the best from each one of the manufacturers to prepare your toolkit. You should be aware of the latest vulnerabilities. There are many advisories that are sent on frequent basis for patches on Linux, patches on, I mean, I'm talking about Red Hat or some of these particular operating systems, Windows, etc. So your organization, your IT department should be subscribing to all these organizations and hopefully get notifications so they can react pretty quickly when things needs to be applied and patched. You have to really understand your cloud service provider security model. So we worked a lot with Amazon. We know what they're capable of doing, which they provide a great set of tools and security on the back end. But at the same time, we need to understand that they don't protect our own data because that's a customer responsibility. As Amazon, some other providers may do something a little bit different. So you need to understand how that works to protect your data and applications. Leverage security as a service solution. I think this is one of the big trends on the last couple of years is companies are not longer implementing hardware or software tools on their own. They are relying on partners or vendors and using these nice cloud services solutions that are out there that are ready to go. Some of these solutions you can get through your provider, some of them you can get through a partner or directly through the manufacturer, but these solutions are easy to implement and they're very robust and they're very, very focused on the cloud security. So you should take advantage of all that instead of reusing old traditional type of tools or hardware. So let's talk about a little bit about the security toolkit and services. We're going to go a little bit more specific in some of them and hopefully give you the overview of what is it, what we think is necessary to manage your cloud workload from a security perspective. We touch bases on the first, starting with log managed security services. We touch bases on that. As I said before, we should be collecting logs from an application and from operating system, and it should be all centralized. In that way, we can get different devices reporting to the centralized server. So when we need to do investigation, we can go to a centralized repository and then do searches and understand what really happened and how things are correlated. These tools usually come with alerts that you can configure based on strings that you're going to find. So for example, if you find that you want to alert on anybody that uses the root account or so like that, you can configure that particular string and you can get alerted. But these tools also allow you to do manual reviews and daily checks, hourly checks, whatever you want to do, just to make sure that those logs are being monitored. Intrusion detection management. So this changed a lot in the last couple of years because we are all used to putting a firewall or an IPS, IDS type of device on front of it, or that comes with the firewall on the regular data center. These days, these have changed. Now this is mostly based on host, not much on an appliance, and basically each one of your servers will have some type of client that will report to a centralized system that say, let me inspect every single packet that goes in and out of that particular device or instance. In that way, you can individually understand if there's some type of issue or attack or something like that. Firewall management, we spoke about it. Companies like AWS, they provide this type of services for you. You can still implement some of these firewalls in addition to if you want to for particular platforms. But the management of the firewall not only requires that you have a very controlled process on who have access, who can make changes, and what type of changes are allowed. You need to have those policies in place, and you need to make sure that they review and they have to have some kind of controls to review access lists and access, etc. Web application firewall. So we talk a little bit about that. There's some services on the cloud that check all the packets that get into your workloads even before they get to the cloud. So if I need to access a URL, I go to the URL. This service will check the packet. If it's okay, we'll send it to my cloud implementation. And in most of the cases, what we have seen, some people were concerned at the beginning about speed, but in reality, because of the cache mechanisms, it's actually very fast and very secure. File integrity monitoring is something that is actually newer as well. In the last couple of years, this has been a big trend, and there's some even free tools that can do this type of monitoring. But what this service does, it checks all the files that you know that they're never going to change. For example, operating system executable files, any application executable files. You define those directories or files and you said, if any of these files change, I need to be alerted. And that's really what this is all about. Most of the times when a device is being attacked, you get some kind of executable files that change. And this tool will detect that and will monitor and alert you for that. Data encryption, we talk about that. It's not just anymore about doing secure encrypted data throughout the network, but also to make sure that your data, especially, for example, your database data, is all encrypted, or your database that is being backed up is encrypted at the backup level, things of that nature. And the next one, the next two, vulnerability scanning and penetration tests, those are the regular processes that should be in place on a regular data center, but they're the same on the cloud. We need to make sure that within a particular period of time, most of the companies do it on a quarterly basis, once a year, etc. These tests are run to ensure that you are protected and you have no holes in your network. Patch management, the process that you do today to make sure your systems are up to date from a security patch perspective. This applies a lot into the Windows systems as patches are released on a monthly basis, but applies into any other operating system as patches are released due to security breaches. And lastly, antivirus management. So make sure that you have your console. You can have different type of tools for, but usually they're vendors that have tools with different flavors for different operating systems that you can implement. Most of the companies implement antivirus on Windows systems, but we see that there are tools actually for Linux systems as well. So this is regularly done on the data center. It's the same thing, doesn't change much on the cloud. Now, let's talk a little bit about controls. I think we talked briefly about that on one of the prior slides, but when you implement security tools and services, you need to make sure that they're controlled so you know that these things are working properly. Some of these controls include, and this is just a set of examples, there's a lot more than that, but we put some of that just to have a discussion here on this call. Access lists and security group reviews. So, for example, if you have managed these firewalls on these providers like Amazon, as an example, you need to make sure that there's alerting set up for changes on network access. We can set up CloudTrail to alert on those. So once we have a change on an access on the network, we get the alert and we can react to it and identify if that change is part of a change control and is part of an approved change or not. We can also build some kind of automation to compare baseline and determine changes. So any changes on infrastructure related to this can be scripted, and we can do comparisons through APIs, and if anything changes, then we get alerted. So this is a really good control that is mostly automated. From an access perspective to the cloud, so Amazon offers the IAM accounts, and if you enable the multi-factor authentication and you use role and that type of access to the cloud, then you can actually audit that as frequent as you want. You can do monthly, weekly, or even daily if you want. But what you can do is make sure that the individuals that are allowed to go to the console have the right access, and anybody that gets added or removed is part of a change control process and approval process, and any discrepancies, they need to be reviewed and approved. Also, the audit to individual systems, because one thing is to access the cloud console, that you have access to all the services, but then you have other access directly to the systems, like SSH access to a Linux server, for example. Make sure that they need to be some kind of audit control on that. CloudTrail is also a great tool from Amazon, as an example, that allows you to see what kind of changes happen from an access perspective, that you can configure certain alerts to get you notified as well. you need to make sure that all the security tools are working and the systems are reporting to them. So major issue on some of the companies is that they implement a security tool, let's say a log tracking mechanism tool, and suddenly some of the servers or the instances stop reporting. And for some time you don't know, and until you need to do some kind of investigation, and then you realize, oh, this system is not being reporting any logs to this particular tool. So you need to make sure that the agents are always running, the consoles are up to date, and you see all the instances that are being reporting in there. Then you need to do some security reporting daily, weekly, monthly. And in some of the cases, from our company perspective, I know because we do this a lot, we have developed a particular dashboards, and we communicate security status on a daily basis to our company stakeholders. And on those dashboards, basically, we said if these are the items that were reviewed, these are the issues that were found, and how things that were resolved or not, etc. Things of coming from different types of tools. As I mentioned before, we have developed a toolkit for security that is involving different vendors and different tools and services. Now we're reaching to the end of the presentation. So the last slide is a little bit of a summary of the things that we talk about throughout the presentation. So we know that the data losses and breaches have increased significantly lately. And we saw those numbers, almost $7 million on record loss on last year. So security on the cloud is become one of the most important focus for organizations. We see that actually on a daily basis. In most of our customers, one of the major risk or major concerns they have is that when they move to the cloud, they have all these tools in place. Some of the companies don't know what needs to be done and how it needs to be done, and this is when we come and help them to implement these type of services and tools, and in some occasions they actually ask us to manage it for them because they don't have the experience nor they have the time or the headcount to do this type of work. Now the security mindset drastically changed on the cloud because now you need to understand what are your responsibilities and what is your service provider responsibilities. So if you understand that clearly, then you can focus on the areas that are of your concern and you can address those with no problem. There's a lot of services and tools out there to help you out with that. Next, we don't really have a single tool to manage the cloud security. You basically will need to build your toolkit, and you need to pick up the tools and the services that are just the best for your type of company and the type of things that you wanted to do. But there's some kind of a general subset, and those are the ones that we saw in one of the prior sections. At least these 8 or 9 items they need to be looked at. Some companies do not implement all of them. They implement most of them, but not all of them. But if you want to be secure and if you want to have all the controls in place, you should actually look into most of them. And lastly, as I mentioned before, you shouldn't spend the time learning on the tools and the services, mostly relying on your partners and vendors to expedite that implementation of those tools. It is, in some cases, it's not that difficult, but having the experience will help you because your partners will know, like on our case, we know some of the specific alerting that needs to be implemented on some of these tools that are critical to maintain security in place. And as I mentioned before as well, some of the companies don't have the bandwidth nor the people or the expertise to not only implement the tools but actually do the monitoring. So monitoring is very important because you can implement a tool, but if you don't have the 24/7 security mindset focused monitoring, then things are going to happen and you're not going to know until the next day or a few days or something like that once you have the time to check those logs or check the alerts, etc. So the robust solution has to go hand in hand with the robust controls and monitoring in place. So we're done on today's presentation. Thank you everyone for the participation. And Jaslyn, I will turn over to you.
Thanks, Jose. Just going to open it up to see if anyone has any questions. You can go ahead and submit them in your questions panel. Okay, Jose, and our first question is, what do you think is the most important security tool that needs to be implemented?
Um, I think that's a tough answer because there's not a single tool that you should be implementing. I can think of a couple that are really critical that every company must have, and one of them would be the log monitoring tool. It's really, really important to have that type of tool. And I would say second will be the intrusion detection system, mostly host-based. Those are probably the top two, but as I said before, you cannot conduct security with only a couple of things. You have to have a set of different tools and services that will complement each other to do your whole security monitoring.
Thanks, Jose. And it looks like we have one more question. Do you recommend companies to implement their own tools or to use services / other companies to help with the deployment and management?
Yeah, and I think we touched bases just on one of the last slides about it. We do recommend companies get advice from vendors like and partners like Auxis. It is not that easy to implement some of the security tools, but just getting a company like us that have the experience is going to help you expedite the implementation, and in some cases, it will help you to actually do the regular ongoing monitoring of these tools.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jose. And so thanks, Jose, to this great presentation and to all of our participants for joining us today. Please look out for our follow-up email with the replay link along with a copy of this presentation. And also, please, if you would take a please take a moment to complete our brief exit survey. I would appreciate it. And then on behalf of Jose and the Auxis team here, we thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.